Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the GGHK Coffee Talk podcast. My name is David Ko. I am the Director of Marketing and Communications for GGHK. And today I'm very, very happy to have Stef Teng and Emery Fung joining us. So guys, I think we should just first start off by introducing yourselves. So Stef, why don't we start with you first? What do you do for GGHK? And
Sure.
what does that actually entail?
All right. So, hi, everyone. I'm Steph, pronounced as she, hers. I'm the Director for Diversity and Inclusion with Gay Games Hong Kong. And in terms of what that entails, it's basically working together with the team to look at how we put together the most inclusive experience that we can for participants, for volunteers, for spectators, and how do we lead this into the way that we're trying to design this whole experience at arts and culture programs, sports, and all the little details that kind of go with that as well.
Great, thank you. Emery, what about you?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Emery. I joined Gay Games around coming up to 2 years very, very soon. And I've initially joined as a football coordinator. And then since then, I also put my hand up when I heard about a D&I team to join Steph. So I also work quite closely with Steph on the D&I side on how we can make the games as inclusive as we can, especially given my background in sports. How do we do that from a sporting perspective as well?
And why did you join the Gay Games in the first place? What motivated you to want to volunteer? Emery.
I've got a very easy answer.
First, Emery?
I did sports management as my degree, and I was told that I would not get a job in Hong Kong, which turned out to be pretty accurate. So I kind of fell out of it a little bit from that perspective. And then when I first heard about the games, I said, well, that's what I studied for, and that's what I wanted to pursue in the career. And so it was really a no-brainer for me to start volunteering.
That's great. And what about you, Steph? What brought you to GGHK?
Okay. So I joined GGHK back in September of 2021 now. And that was, I believe 3 years after it was announced that Gay Games Hong Kong had won the next Gay Games bid. And I think for me, it was initially great. This is coming. I'm curious to see what's going to happen. And I think as part of that process, going and seeing I guess what was happening to the world and how that was impacting a lot of things, including the way the games would be run. I think there was that question about, okay, there's, I guess in a separate capacity, I was also involved in hearing about the games from a corporate side, because I do work in D&I as well in my day job, and we have been approached and exploring with Gay Games as well about how we could potentially partner or sponsor. And I think looking at it from that angle gave me a different insight into how things were running. At the same time, also an idea that, there's some gaps in the way that we're approaching this. And what are some of the ways that maybe my skills or my experience could help maybe of value here to be able to add in a different point of view, a different point of lens, for example, on some things that we could be positioning or pitching or thinking about when we're also speaking to potential sponsors and everything else. And, point that I was just thinking, I am part of the community. This is happening. Why don't I just get involved and also be part of the change and be part of the solution? And to be honest, it's a very iconic, I think, once in a lifetime thing to be doing, for sure. And to let that, I think, chance, also opportunity go by and not be part of it, that would have been a big miss. So that was why I had decided to volunteer as well.
That's great. That's great. And I'm actually really excited about today's topic, because even though I myself am a member of the LGBTQ community, I have to admit that my knowledge about the trans community is pretty poor. And so we're constantly in this state of needing to learn more and be educated. And so I really hope that today we can help to address some of the questions that people may have. And I think a question that often comes up is, how are trans athletes represented in the wider world? So I guess, Emery, you coming from a sports background, how is the state of affairs for trans athletes? Is it pretty poor right now, or are things starting to look up a bit?
Yeah, so I think if you've been anywhere near TV or online, you've been seeing a lot of headlines about the trans kind of athlete community in the last at least couple of years, and there's been, I would say, generally a mixed bag of perspective. Obviously, I think the more we talk about it, the more it's going to help us to find what's the best solution going forward. We also understand that this is obviously a very, very new territory for everyone, including myself, who's trans and who plays sports. So, we don't claim to have the exact perfect answer and one solution that will fit every single sport in the world. But we are aware that, by having this conversation, having these debates as well, we'll find basically, how do we create an environment where sports can be as exclusive as we can. From my perspective, growing up in school, living in the UK where sport is very traditionally still being split up into your gender. So you'll play specific sport depending on what gender you are. That also created a divide between kind of your class and kind of your community as well, especially you don't feel like you belong in that particular gender that you were assigned at birth. So I have not experienced where, in a sporting kind of world where, I feel very, very included. Even though I love sport, I still play sport and I have been in the sport scene for all my life, as long as I can remember. But there are still pain points where, especially going to changing rooms, going in and out, having showers after games and things like that, where it's still a little bit uncomfortable. Probably not for people who are around me, for myself as well, because I don't feel like I belong in the female changing rooms. So there's definitely still a lot of work to be done, but I'm very glad at least it's being talked about and it's being considered. I know a lot of different kind of sporting organizations are also looking at ways and asking for advice from the community. So I think it's looking good where we stand at the moment, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
So I think in the news recently, for example, there's been a lot of mention. There's a movement, frankly, right now of pushing trans athletes to compete based on their biological or birth gender via DNA analysis. What do you think of that trend, and what's inherently wrong with it, do you think?
Do you want to take this one, Emery, or do you want me to go first?
You can go first, yeah.
Okay, all right. I think taking a step back, gender is one of those things that it's the first thing that hits you, I think, as a very basic construct to the way you navigate the world and understand your basic identity, right? And that bleeds into everything else. Maybe a simple example would be whenever I hear, a friend of mine, colleagues, they're pregnant, right? And the first question that comes to mind that I always ask, and I try to hold back myself now when I realize it, is, oh, great, do you know the gender? And I was thinking, does it matter? Why is it so important to me for me to know what that gender is? Was it because then I would know then how to respond, or what else how I could direct the conversation towards things? And I think it just, for me, when I thought about it, I was like, okay, this hits deep, this hits automatically, and it's very much, I think, intrinsic, at least for, I'd say, my generation. I don't know about the younger groups now. But it's one of those I think it's a very key part of our identity that we often take for granted, especially for those where we don't feel conflict between that. And I think not having that experience is something that having to keep myself top of mind as well. That would be very different for somebody who does feel that conflict and what that could be like. And I think to your point about sports itself and the whole conversation about trans inclusion in sports, it's controversial, right? Because it's controversial, not because it has to be, but just because of the way that we've been socializing to all these things around, becoming a conversation where are we protecting women's sports, for example, versus trans inclusion. And I wish that wasn't the narrative that was out there, because that is not helpful. That kind of divides the pie for everybody else. But I think to also then further understand deeper behind those things, it's to your point about, I did want to talk a little bit about the state of sports for trans athletes as well. And I don't think it's not a great space for trans athletes or for cis women athletes as well, because it's a controversial topic. There's a lot of emotions on both sides, and that's how it is. But I think the conversation has gone so heated that it's impossible that, we don't allow ourselves the space to discuss these
It's
things.
so emotional right
with empathy
now,
and
right?
with safety. Yes, very much so. And it's important just, I think, to try to divorce ourselves a little bit from that. But I do want to recognize that there's so much pressure on trans athletes to perform. There's so much pressure on them to represent for their community as well. And when you add to how that can impact their performance itself at the elite stage, that I think has some very real impact. So going back, taking a step back and just remembering that they're all people, that we're all human beings, right? And they are, I think, subject to a much level higher scrutiny than they really need to be. So I guess coming back to the questions here around how then does that integrate for us with the games, particularly around how do we create an inclusive space for everybody else. And I think what the Olympics committee, the IOC, did with going into saying, we want to let each sport kind of decide what this looks like for the guidance that you want to go ahead with. And I think that makes sense because each sport requires a different set of skills, different set of muscles, different set. I think it can't be one blanket stop approach for it, but I think it is a massive step in the right direction. And for the games itself, because we're looking at things from a community angle and inclusion and a personal best angle, I think there is no reason why I'll put it this way. I think when it comes to the concept of fairness, and I think how that gets hijacked between, is it fair to have a trans woman compete against a cis woman? If we're looking at this from a point of view of personal best, that doesn't really come into consideration at all. This is just about having sports, playing it together, playing it with your community, playing it with allies, playing it with people you normally wouldn't have the chance to have interactions with, and just being part of being there together, I think, and having a good time. That's ideally where I think we should be going, and where I see some of the sticky challenges tend to be in this conversation. But hopefully the games itself not being an elite competition does allow for that experimentation to happen and people to get used to the idea as well. But I digress.
No, it's interesting what you said, because you mentioned the values of the gay games, right? Which is participation, inclusion, and personal best. So it's not about necessarily winning a world record, beating somebody. It's about challenging your own personal best, right? So I think it's important that we understand that we prioritize community participation above all else. But I guess this ongoing debate is going to kind of rage on for a while because it's so emotional. But so Emery, for example, as yourself, someone who's transgender and in the sports world, where do you see this trend moving in the future? Do you think there's hope that this will be resolved, for example?
Yeah, I think it's going to take a long time. We have to bear in mind as well that sport has got such a long history. It's such a long history, we can sometimes we forget about how long it's been. So we can't expect to change that overnight, let alone in a few years. So it's going to be a long kind of journey to go. But I think in terms of what it looks like and what it should look like in the future, I think we also have to consider from an education perspective, when we're doing PE in school, what should that look like? Especially, before puberty, for example. How do we integrate that? Because for me, I went to an all-girls school. So that really kind of took me out of that experience of, participating in an all gender or mixed gender at least. So there's still a lot of questions, and there's a lot of things that we need to look at from a very end of grassroots level of sports all the way to elite sport. I think for the games itself, or what we're trying to do is kind of looking at that in between of what that should look like from a community first level. Like Stef said, that we are lucky in a sense where we probably have a bit more room to experiment in that sense, and hopefully once we get some kind of solution, some kind of actually this works, this doesn't work, then hopefully the other future competitions can look into that. And maybe even schools in the future and look into that and say, okay, why don't we try this for ourselves as well and see how that goes? So I think it's going to be a lot of trial and error. I don't think anyone's going to have any perfect answer right now. But I think that's the same as everything else in life, that we're never going to get that one thing right the first time. It's going to take a long time, especially in the sports environment where it's so much complication, there's so many rules, so many governing bodies, there's so many different moving pieces, and also culturally as well, and you throw in the countries and all that kind of stuff. But I think, like I said earlier, I think it starts with conversation, it starts with trialing and experimenting, and once we have some glimpse of what it works, and it should take us to the next level. And kind of, I think going back to the DNA thing just quickly as well, I think, I understand where it can come from because we want to use kind of a science approach, but at the same time, we also neglect, let's say, people who are intersex. How do we put those people in categories, for example? And further as well, you can't just accept someone who's trans in everyday life, but when it's in sports, no, we consider you as something different. So that to me does not make a lot of sense either. We have to, once we accept someone who's trans, we can't just say, you can only be trans, or we can accept you as male in this particular area of your life, but everything else is going to be different. It doesn't work like that. So for me, I will still have questions about kind of the DNA approach. But again, we're still kind of at that stage where we're exploring, experimenting what works.
And I think in a sense, it's also cisgender women, for example. This matters to them as well, because fundamentally we're challenging this idea that, or this assumption that men are inherently faster, stronger, better at sports, right? And this is a concept that cisgender women have been challenging for many years, because the flip side of that, of course, is, that women are inherently weaker or slower. And I think a lot of elite cisgender women athletes would have a problem with that approach. And I think something that you mentioned earlier, Emery, about even within cisgender men, hormone levels are different, right? So how detailed do you want to get into this classification? Can you talk a little bit more about what that means when we talk about different hormone levels among men?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think it's probably quite well established that, women obviously have different cycles when it comes to hormones, every month. But at the same time, men actually also have different hormone cycles as well. So let's say from a sports, from the Olympics, what they've been doing so far is that they use hormone level as a threshold on how athletes can compete in categories. But there's been a couple of examples where cisgender women has been banned from the sport because their hormones levels were slightly higher in testosterone. Now, that's not fair to them because they weren't trans athlete, they were cisgender. So that question is that, is the hormone levels accurate enough for us to determine where they sit? And also different men have different hormone levels. So who's to say this hormone level is what we consider as male and this level is female? Because in reality, all our hormones goes in and out, and every person's got a very different hormone level. So that also would create next kind of, the question would be, what is considered as a level of hormone that is for men? Now, I think that's a very, very binary approach of classifying what men means and what female means. And that can also be quite dangerous as well. For example, we've already seen a couple of cases where cisgender has been banned from the sport, which also makes no sense, and it's not fair on them. So that would be the first thing about the hormone levels.
Yeah, I want to talk
then,
to Stef about this as well, because Stef, I understand that you and Emery, you are in the process of just doing a full sweep of the gay games sports categories and making sure that we're adhering to our DEI principles as well. And I know that that's not concluded yet, and I know that you'll be sharing the results later. But I think it's applaudable that you are just making sure that we're true to our principles. Now, so for example, I'm very involved in the dragon boat sport. So in the dragon boat sport, we have 3 categories now. We've got men, we've got women, and we've got the open / non-gender category. And that seems to be working very well. I think the registration we're getting a lot of registrations for Dragon Boat. But there will always be people that say, well, in the non-gender category, you could have 9 men and 1 cisgender woman, for example. So if you're not setting a limit on the balance of different genders, you're definitely not leveling the playing field. You're randomizing the playing field, so to speak. And I guess the question ultimately is, does it matter, especially within the scope of the gay games, where our focus is on involvement and community? Like, what's your view on people that challenge us on this?
Sure. And you mentioned it earlier already, David. Around, we are an elite sports organization. Although I will say, when the games we think back to the founder of the games, Tom Waddell, and what he was trying to achieve when he first, went ahead with the idea for the first gay games. It was trying to replicate the Olympic experience, but for everybody. It didn't have to be for elite athletes, right? It was meant to be open to any ability level in the first place. And one of the things that he really didn't enjoy as well was the idea that everybody had to represent a country as part of the Olympics. But the idea was then that you came and represented yourself, right? You didn't have to be representing my city. If you wanted to, I think, all hats to you. I'm not going to take that away from you. But at the end of the day, it wasn't about dividing lines. And it wasn't about dividing lines according to where you grew up or what your passport says. It wasn't about dividing lines according to, how much time you spent yourself training in the sport. What's your ability level? And I think taking that essence and bringing it back into today, where all these questions are kind of around us as well. It's to me it's the same. Knowing you're entering a community sport where what we're trying to do is to deconstruct the elite sports, experience, but for everyday folks as well as we can. That also means giving ourselves flexibility and leeway to maybe look at the way that we've run sports in the past and find new ways for us that we could be doing this. And doing so, I think, in a safe manner that has no real impact, I think, to participants aside from, hey, I'm signing up for the sports. This is the way that this is being set up. It's open category, open season. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person with one cis woman, the team with one cis woman, is not going to stand a chance. For example, I do want to just say that it is providing an open playing field for anybody that decides to, I want to take this group, this community that I'm, this team I believe in, and I want to go in and participate together and see what we can achieve together. I think it's much less it's about knowing that you're going to an open playing field that's trying to be as inclusive as possible and trying to encourage the mix up as much as possible. To the point, I think what you said about how we're looking at the categories here as well. And one of the things that we did notice was that there is a lot of different ways that we're calling categories: open, non-gender, gender X, for example. And, the whole gender spectrum is so open, right? And being genderqueer, there's so many different ways to identify. It's, I think, impossible to try to group that all into just one category. So we are trying to go with the naming of all gender categories to cover this whole spectrum as a group, to kind of say all genders are welcome. And we are also looking at whereby sports, where it makes sense for us to have, if there has to be, a quota, and if that would be what would make sense. So we are playing around with, we are having that conversation right now to see and explore, socialize what we think is most in line with the values of what we're trying to achieve, the outcomes of what we're trying to drive forward, and hopefully open new paths for other sporting organizations or other communities to also consider this is a new way that we could try this out and see what comes back from that. So I think it's really, again, keeping an open mind. We aren't here to give you a full elite sports experience. You are here to participate in a community sports experience that's designed to be as inclusive as possible, knowing that we are opening it up to the full gender spectrum as well. So, I mean, if you're registered or if you're thinking about registering, do register. Come prepared for something that's probably going to be a little bit different. And I'd say just keep an open mind and have fun. This is here about, the point about personal bests and personal news maybe as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, a lot of the narrative when it comes to trans athletes and being inclusive to outside the traditional gender of men and women, what we view as traditional gender anyway, is that a lot of it is based on what is fair. But I think first is that I think what I would like to kind of discuss, quite an interesting topic, is that what is fairness to begin with. If you look at sport itself, sport never really was a lot of it is not built on fairness. If you look at winter sport, for example, countries who traditionally are who is not a winter or cold country have no access to snow, have no access to ski slopes. They never knew really going to have a huge amount of organizations or pathway to compete in those elite sports. Now, is that not fair, or is that fair? What is fair to begin with in sports? And a lot of sport as well, when it comes to elite sport, even a lot of it's to do with luck, and a lot of it's to do with your sporting spirit. So depending on where you were born, what access you had, what your ability, all that kind of stuff. None of that stuff really was built on the assumption of how fair that is. But when we talk about trans in sport, that seems to be the first question people raise up. But in reality, if you really kind of look at sport, that is, we obviously want to compete in the most fairest competitions at all times. That's what we all strive for. But in reality, sometimes is not going to be used as the first indicator of how sport competition should look like. And the second thing, a lot of the narrative comes up is that is that a danger to women's sport? Are we protecting women? Let's say for my case, because of my gender marker on my ID and various reasons at the moment, I'm still only able to compete in women's sport, which means I'm in and around women's changing rooms. Now, is that protecting women as well? We always kind of look at the side where it's the other way around, where from what we call MTM, male to female. But a lot of the times we don't consider the other side for myself, where I'm going from FTM, where I'm not able to be in the men's changing room. I live, and all my lives I live like a man. I know I conduct myself like that, and identify as such. But yet I'm allowed to be in the women's changing room. So that also comes to the question of, is that fair, and is that also protecting women?
I love that the Gay Games is blazing a trail, in a sense, where we're leaning into this very controversial area head on, and we're making a lot of decisions. And like you guys said, it's a little bit of trial and error, but at the very least, we're doing something to try different things to make sure that we reach a point where there are solutions that work for everybody. And so, kudos to you guys for really pushing this through. And I know that we talked a lot about athletes and participants in the Gay Games. For spectators as well, are we also ensuring that, something more mundane, but in terms of like facilities, for example, at all the venues, are we also making sure that we support all gender identities as well?
Emery, I'll take this one.
Yeah. I think that's definitely one of our key things to look at as well as a D&I team. We're not looking at it just purely from a sporting background, sporting perspective. We're also looking at the entire kind of event itself, from, let's say, the very kind of macro level, the arts and culture, for example. How can we be as inclusive as we can from that perspective, down to the venue, like you mentioned, not just from an LGBT standpoint, but also from a ability standpoint. Do we have access for wheelchair, for people who are disabled to come to the games? Are they able to come to the actual venue? Are they able to use the facilities there? So we're looking at all angles from the very kind of D&I macro level at all strands, not just the LGBT community. We are conscious that, and we are very aware that what we stand for is games for all, and that's what we strive for. So we can't just look at trans or non-binary as a key focus. We're looking at every level. So when it comes to that, specifically for the venues, for example, whenever we have venue partners and stuff and partners, we are also in discussion with them on how they can make the venue as inclusive as they can. Now, we understand from an infrastructure building point of view, there's not a lot of things that we can change in that short space of time, but what we can do is act as an advisory, saying that, look, we would encourage you to look at these following points. This is what we are expecting from our venue partners. We understand you can't fulfill all of them, but that's what we encourage you to and what we advise you to do. And probably what we kind of mentioned and been touching on earlier as well is that perhaps once they've trialed those kind of I guess, changes in their own facilities and own their venues, maybe they'll actually adopt that in the future after the games is finished. And that's what we can really hope for, is that give people some ideas and examples that they can kind of explore in no matter whatever capacity, from a venue perspective, from a transportation perspective, for example, from arts and culture, how we can just be more inclusive overall. And I think that's what we can really kind of aim for as the games.
Yeah, it's interesting. So even when we did the venue visit for the Dragon Boat venue, which is Shingmen River, we were in a conversation with the Dragon Boat Federation about, okay, you have to make sure that we have toilet facilities that cater to non-binary people as well. And I could see the gears turning on the part of the Federation official. And to me, it was gratifying because we're, in a sense, educating people in the sports world about all of these different gender issues. And I even just in working with the Dragon Boat Federation, we were already educating people. And so I just feel like even just hosting the gay games, we're already changing a lot of minds and educating a lot of people. Now, I want to move on to talk about something different, which is a question that we get occasionally, which is for trans people, queer people that visit Hong Kong, is it safe, right? So is Hong Kong safe for trans people? Emery, can you give us a little bit of insight? Do they have anything to worry about from the moment they land in Hong Kong, all through the different venues and events that they go to?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. I can say definitely from my personal experience that I living in Hong Kong, born in Hong Kong, and then lived here, that I've never really had a huge problem as a trans person in Hong Kong. Now, again, I do appreciate and conscious that is only my personal experience, but from what I understand from my community as well, the state of, I guess, being trans or non-binary in Hong Kong is actually sometimes safer from what we hear in the news as well, in that sense, because I think people generally speaking from Hong Kong, if you're not really kind of doing anything or disrupting their way, they're not going to go out of their way and attack you or have slurs. To my understanding, Hong Kong has not been, there's been no record of hate crime in Hong Kong when it comes to trans or non-binary folks. So I think from a safety perspective, I think that there's no kind of real issues that people need to be concerned with. Now, in terms of the question of the awareness or education level when it comes to these topics, I think there is some gap. But I think if you were to walk around or come to the games for Hong Kong or any kind of other time coming to Hong Kong, not just within the games period, it's a very safe city to do so.
Yeah, I think Hong Kong people in general are very live and let live. They don't really get out of their way to make life difficult for people that they feel might be different from them. And as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, Hong Kong has one of the lowest crime rates in the world. There's very little evidence of hate crime here, so it's a very safe place to visit. And even when you land at the airport and you're going through immigration, you're not going to be hassled regardless of your gender identity. You can freely tell people that you're coming to the gay games. It doesn't matter. We partner with the government on a lot of the operations and logistics of the games. I want to move on to now talk about, I guess, this recent case, right, that literally just got announced, the outcome a couple of days ago, which is this person, Henry, who sued the Hong Kong government and won because he wanted to have his gender identity on his identity card, his ID card, changed, and he didn't have to go through a surgical procedure to physically be altered in order to be allowed to do that. Do you think that's a win for Hong Kong? And what do you think? What difference does this make for us?
Yeah, definitely a win. But I do want to make sure and kind of be conscious that it is a small step and what I consider probably a small win. And what I mean by that is that this covers perhaps only one area or the initial steps anyway, as a trans person changing or what I like to call updating their kind of their gender amongst documents and whatnot. Hong Kong ID is an interesting thing because Hong Kong ID, for those who don't know, is what Hong Kong use as a or what it says, ID card. It's an identification.
It's like a social security card, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you use it a lot. You use it for registration, for anything basically. Your bills, your workplace. You do present your Hong Kong ID. Now the trouble before the ruling was that if you're going for a job interview, for example, or registration for anything, and what it says on your ID card the gender-wise does not reflect what you look like, it can be quite an awkward and quite an intrusive experience and quite traumatic at times. And what the rule was before that, you had to go through the full surgery, what they call the full SRS. And that, again, sometimes is not, it does not make sense for the individual. For example, it could be for health reasons, it could be for financial reasons, or it could be just a personal choice. So by removing that requirement to change your legal ID is a massive step in the right direction. But we also have to be conscious that it's only happened yesterday. We don't know what it looks like in terms of how it's being implemented, how long it's going to take, what's the procedure to actually get it updated in the future, and what are the other complications that might arise in the future as well. There's been another case, not so similar, but relatively similar case with Miss W, also from Hong Kong. But that case was actually ruled back in 2008. Now, since that court case ruled in her favour that she was able to marry legally in Hong Kong after changing her gender markers on her Hong Kong ID, that actually has not been implemented by the authorities. So that has been taking a long time. Even though the ruling's gone past, we won the case in that sense, but the actual follow-up has not been implemented. So a lot of the questions in the community is that, yes, we recognise it's a great win and it's a huge statement for our community, but in reality, what does that look like? What's the timeline? And is that still being how much of a priority is that being taken as for it to be coming to life, and that I'm actually able to go to the immigration department and actually change my gender? So that's still a question that we kind of have at the moment amongst the community. But of course, we're very happy about what happened. The ruling is a huge win. In terms of, you look at the statement and all the press and all the court press release and whatnot, if you compare it to what happened yesterday and compared to the case with Miss W almost a decade ago now, or more than, the wording and the language is a lot more positive when it comes to transgender people in Hong Kong. So it really shows the stride we've taken in Hong Kong, in particular for trans people. But we still have to be conscious that we haven't won the full fight yet. In that sense, I know there's still a lot of steps to go, but we'll take what we can today.
So now that, just to ask a clarifying question, now that people can update their gender on their ID card, does that mean that an FTM person can marry a cis female now? Is that clear, or is that still up in the air?
Yeah, so that is not very, very clear from what I understand, because on the court case, if you look at the press releases from the court, there's a lot of emphasis that this is not about the legal gender. Now, the Hong Kong ID really serves as a identification purposes. So when you're registering for vouchers or whatever it may be that in your everyday life, but that has no bearing to your legal gender. And what that essentially means is what it says on your birth certificate. So even though if I can change my ID, my Hong Kong ID to male, for example, tomorrow, let's say, I'm still not able to change my birth certificate's gender, which means in the light of the law, I'm still in a same-sex marriage, and at the moment, that's not possible in Hong Kong as of yet. Now, again, like what I mentioned earlier, is that this might be the first step for us to kind of achieve that eventually, but we in the very early stages of changing. So the complication of the gender perspective is that Hong Kong ID, yes, is a win, but it does not mean everything in our lives, especially in the Hong Kong region.
Do you see this sort of change continuing to happen, or do you think that there'll be a backlash at some point that will bring us 2 steps back? Are you confident? Are you feeling positive?
Yeah, as of the time of recording, when the ruling came out yesterday, everything I've seen so far has been very, very positive. So I don't know what will happen tomorrow or a week later, but from what I can see and what I can sense from the community all around, people who are in the community and outside the community, in the corporate world, and even down to my parents, the reaction has been very, very positive. And if we look at the case from 2008 for Miss W and compared to Henry today, I think the press has been very different in terms of the tone of it and the general language being used around the press, around the case, and even from the court itself. So there's been a significant change. So from that point of view, I see no reason we will go back to square one. And I think, that's also going to open up a lot of doors and a lot more discussion in a more public sense, in a more general public sense, that people will probably have a bit more appetite and just generally a bit more exposed to these topics. So from my perspective, I can only see as a good thing and a positive thing. But, obviously when it comes down to the actual legal side of things, that's still quite a different discussion but I think it is a positive thing overall.
That's great. Emery and Stef, I know your time is very precious, so I really appreciate you spending this hour with me. Before we go, any words that you want to say to the people all around the world that are considering coming to Hong Kong and participating either as sports participants or spectators or party goers? What do you want them to know? Stef, do you want to share your thoughts?
What do we want them to know? Oh, that's a lot. That's a big question, David.
Come to Hong Kong. Right?
Yes, come to Hong Kong. I mean, safety-wise, Hong Kong has, I think, one of the best safety records. There are very low incidences of violent crime, everything else. I do want to say, given where we are, things are not perfect, obviously, and there's still a ways to go. But things are heading in a positive trend direction. Public sentiment and support of the LGBTQ community overall has been on the up. Similarly, social issues around diversity, inclusion, racial equity, and everything else is also rising in awareness in this region, and it's bringing to surface a lot of things for conversation. And it's I think it's a very positive time to be coming to Hong Kong. I mean, keep an open mind. I want to say be safe, obviously, as well. Do your preparation before booking your flights and coming over. But, if you're looking for support around questions or who you could connect to or the communities and everything else, I mean, I believe we do have a few Facebook groups, David, dedicated to the gay games in case you want to ask questions. But you could also just pop us a question if there's something specific you'd like to ask or specific communities you'd like to be connected to. We can definitely help to join and connect the dots here as well. So you're not in this alone. There's a wonderful community here waiting to receive you and welcome you. So yeah, if you're thinking about it, don't think too hard. Look at your calendar. Hong Kong's lovely at that time of the year. Yes.
Thank you.
From my side, I think it's just, I think people will be surprised of what Hong Kong looks like if they haven't been to Hong Kong before. I think a lot of people don't really associate, I guess, when you say sports, Hong Kong is not in your first mind, right? And I think, it's going to be a great time for us to really showcase to people that actually Hong Kong is a wonderful place for sporting communities, as well as the LGBT communities. I love how, we're able to also add category at sports like dragon boating and trail running in the games and mahjong as well, where it's really kind of showcase what the Hong Kong landscape looks like. I said that people don't think about sport in Hong Kong as a forefront of mind, but when we say Hong Kong, definitely the landscape, the hikes, all these trails are also not probably the first thing people think of. They think about tall concrete buildings, concrete jungle, that kind of thing. So I think it's going to be a great surprise, and I think people would be like, oh, actually, Hong Kong is a great place for sports as well. So I'm really excited for people to come over, and I think we all need it after COVID and stuff the last couple of years. I think it's going to be a great kind of festival for the entire Hong Kong, not just the LGBT community.
Exactly.
Let me
Thank you
just
so
add
much.
to that. If you're a less sporting individual like myself, there's also, I want to say there's also a very vibrant arts and culture scene here. Party scene, social scene, whatever you're into. Hong Kong usually typically has it.
Yeah, exactly. There's and I can say for a fact that there'll be lots of art exhibitions, concerts, performances. It's going to be and of course lots of parties. So it's going to be a very fun week for everyone that comes to Hong Kong. And for people that are thinking of registering, the Marriott promo codes are already out. So just Google Marriott Hong Kong Gay Games, and you'll see you'll be taken to the landing page where you can actually start to book the hotel rooms. So we stand ready to welcome everyone to Hong Kong for November. So with that, thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate your time, and looking forward to continuing the conversation with you once all of the DEI categorization work is done. Then we can start to talk about that as well and provide an update for everybody. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having us. Thank you,
Thanks for
David.
having us, David.
Thanks, guys.